There's just so many examples um, of ridiculous regulations. In Argentina, for example, satellite internet was banned before Milei, so there was no Starlink. But Argentina is the 8th largest country in the world, with so many people working in the countryside that need internet. As of 2023, you had to have internet to be connected into the global economy. This was not allowed under non-Milei governments, right? So this has changed. So many other things have changed.
This is Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio.
Welcome to Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio, the show that brings you the voices of freedom's champions from around every corner of the globe. We shine a spotlight on the leaders who are fighting for individual liberty, limited government, and free enterprise right here, whose ideas are most under threat and most needed. Well, today's guest brings us a front row insight into one of the most fascinating experiments in free market reform that is happening anywhere in the world, and that is in Argentina. Under President Javier Milei. Marcos Falcone is a policy analyst at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty, and he's one of the clearest voices tracking and shaping the future of liberty in Latin America. Stay with us. We're diving into the most pressing question. Is Milei's bold agenda for liberty working? What comes next? So, Marcos, we're going to start right there. I've got to get your thoughts on this. On the global stage, there may be no better modern economic experiment than what's happening in Argentina. So, in your view, is Milei doing a good job?
Well, hi, Michael. Thank you for the invite. Thank you, Atlas Network, for this opportunity to discuss my own country, Argentina. I think so far, so good, we could say about Milei. It's been a little over 2 years since Milei took office in December 2023. And we have to remember what Argentina looked like at that point, right? Argentina was a country that showed an annual inflation figure of over 200%, right? Where it was impossible to get goods into the country because there were so many restrictions and regulations and tariffs. There were capital controls. The economy hadn't grown in almost or over a decade, actually. This was a chaotic country, a country where people, from which people tended to leave, actually. There was this widespread pessimistic sense, particularly among the youth. And you could listen to parents, and older people saying, oh, our children are leaving and there's nothing that we can do to stop them, right? And then Milei takes office, and he completely transforms particularly Argentina's macroeconomic situation in a good way, and particularly in ways that other people, other politicians, basically everyone that was not Milei, said it was impossible to do. Because the first thing that Milei does when he takes office is he balances the budget, which is something that we continue to hear about all over the world, that governments need to be responsible with the money that they spend, with taxpayers' money, that they have to balance the budget, that the debt cannot balloon for, ad aeternum. And yet in Argentina, this advice hadn't been heeded for so long. And so Argentina showed something like a 5% GDP deficit, which Milei turned into a balanced budget in a matter of a month, right? So this, of course, was extreme. I haven't found any records of democratically elected governments governing under a constitution, under the rule of law, that do not go through a default on their debt or hyperinflation, which are able to manage such a drastic fall in public spending, because it was basically about decline in public spending, which caused Milei to balance the budget. It wasn't that he all of a sudden decided to raise taxes, because that would have gone against his libertarian ideas. Instead, what he said was, we need to curb spending. This has gotten out of control. We need to balance the budget. And so he did. And that by itself set a totally different expectation about the Argentine economy and where it was headed. It became clear that we now had a president that was fiscally responsible and that would be fiscally responsible for as long as he stays in office. 2 years into Milei's presidency, that is still a fact, right? Argentina continues to have a balanced budget. And what that has caused is that inflation, which peaked at 25% in December 2023, is now down to between 2 and 2.5% a month, which is still, of course, an enormous figure, a tremendously high figure for any other country in the world, but is relatively low and stable in Argentina. Of course, Milei wants to continue with that process, but it's not easy, right? Because it's not just balancing the budget. Milei has had to face innumerable problems and issues with the Argentine economy. And so capital controls, for example, are now lifted. Starting January 1st, there are no capital controls in Argentina for businesses. But of course, he has to deal with all of the money that was sort of trapped in Argentina in recent years because other governments wouldn't allow foreign businesses to take their money to their own countries, for example, right? Which caused a crisis of confidence, which made a lot of people wary of investing in Argentina, right? Argentina's economy was also, and is still, heavily regulated. And so Milei set up a ministry for deregulation, which is something that was unprecedented in Argentina, that I believe actually had some sort of impact even in the United States with the setup of Dodge, whatever that has accomplished so far. And regardless of the differences between a ministry for deregulation and a department of government efficiency, which are not the same thing, really, conceptually, right? This ministry for deregulation, literally the only thing that they do is they try to deregulate Argentina's economy. They sit in their offices all day thinking about what they can improve, listening to the people who bring their complaints. They even set up a website where people can just anonymously report instances where regulation hinders economic activity. And there's just so many examples of ridiculous regulations. In Argentina, for example, satellite internet was banned before Milei, so there was no Starlink. But Argentina is the 8th largest country in the world, with so many people working in the countryside that need internet. As of 2023, you had to have internet to be connected into the global economy. This was not allowed under non-Milei governments, right? So this has changed. So many other things have changed. I wrote with my colleague Ryan Byrne from the Cato Institute a piece on how Milei eliminated rent control and replaced it with nothing, basically, within 10 days of taking office, right? So he issued a decree, and we can talk about how this has been done, right? Because there's some debate about decrees and laws and Congress. Milei issued a sort of mega deregulation decree within 10 days of taking office. And one of those items within that decree was the elimination of rent control. But it was not just, a modification of the law that regulated rent control. It was a total ban sort of on rent control. And this has caused tremendous progress in Argentina's rental market. The supply of apartments in Buenos Aires rose by 200% in just 1 year. Real prices came down 30%. This is something that the people can feel, right? Of course, there's other problems. There's other problems with wages, with inflation that is still there, that is still coming back. It's still coming down, but it's still a problem. But in different areas, you can see changes that the Milei administration is trying to implement, of course, under a sort of ultra-minority position in Congress, because we have to remember everything that Milei has done, he has done with or almost everything, because now, after the midterms, we have a new Congress, but almost everything that Milei done, everything that he did in his first 2 years was done with only 10 to 15% of Congress, right? And by striking alliances, he was able to pass a law, for example, an omnibus bill that was, of course, much shorter than the government intended originally because they had to compromise. And so Milei has worked with Congress, but we have to remember most of the change that is seen in Argentina right now has come directly through Milei, because Milei really didn't have the necessary congressional support. He still doesn't, but he's now in a much better position because after these 2 years of economic reforms, initial economic reforms, sort of first generation economic reforms, because now Milei is talking about the second, the third generation reforms. After that, the public decided that the government had done a good job, right? And so this is how we get to October 2025, when Milei sweeps basically the election and is now in a much stronger position to continue to implement economic reform in Argentina. Sorry if this was too long, but it's just a short summary from which we can go anywhere really on Milei.
Yeah, and listen, I asked you a pretty big question to open up about, like, is he doing a good job, or what do you think? And there's a lot to that, right? You had to get some context and everything. I appreciate that, but you touched on these recent elections. I'm going to talk about that because the elections were both an indication of where the Argentinian population felt that the country was headed, what direction was it going in, what was his leadership doing. Not only did he win, he really won the seats that he needed to be able to get more legislative reform, or legislative support, I should say, behind his agenda. So what does that mean, or what do you expect we're going to now see? Because the rest of the world would say, goodness, look at the turn that Argentina's had and look at all the big change that he's made. But he couldn't even do everything in his agenda yet. Now, do you think post-election that we're going to see an even more robust agenda and transformation in Argentina?
I think so, but I would also qualify that by saying that Milei still doesn't have a majority in Congress. But of course, the political outlook in Argentina has changed pretty dramatically, really, in the past 3 or 4 months. Because before the midterms, the sort of goal for the government was to secure 1/3 of the House of Representatives, because that would shield the government from vetoes. So for you to picture how fragile Milei's government was, he was trying to lower spending and so balance the budget. But the opposition was against that. And so they kept passing laws that increased public spending that Milei had to veto. But then what was the problem? That under Argentine law, if Congress gets 2/3 of both chambers, the House and the Senate, then they can override that veto. And so the expectation for Milei before this midterm was that the government would get at least 1/3 in the House, because that's where it was easiest to get this minority, and sort of shield Milei from sabotage, if you will. But now after the election, what we see is something different. We see that Milei now controls about 40% of the House and 1/3 of the Senate. And that if he builds alliances with centrist parties, that is, parties that at some point have sided with the opposition, but that also have sided with Milei, for example, during the Omnibus Bill discussion in 2024, if he does that, then he can get to a majority. And we actually have just seen that, because during the month of December, Milei called for special sessions for Congress to discuss a number of issues, including the budget, basically. And the government has been able to pass its first budget in 2 years, which is surprising, perhaps, from a foreigner's perspective, because if I've just told you that Milei has balanced the budget, but there is no official budget, then how was he able to do it? And of course, Milei used, these loopholes in Argentine law, because everything was done legally, constitutionally. But there is this provision in Argentine law that says that if a government can't get a budget passed for a certain year, then the government can continue to use the budget from the previous year. And in a context where you have 200% inflation or 100% inflation as it comes down, or 50% or whatever, those numbers get outdated so quickly that you basically can do anything with the budget. Now, the miracle in this case is that we actually have a fiscally responsible president, because if this had been the other way around and we had a spendthrift candidate or president, then it could have been a disaster. But Milei actually used this loophole, which was usually used to spend more, in this case to spend less, right? But of course, that is a problem institutionally, because you want to have a budget, you want to have, official expectations for the world to see. You want to show, investors that they can trust Argentina, then that this country is going back to normal. And so you have to have a budget passed. And Milei has just been able to do that after he called for a special session in December. Now, I wish we could see other reforms coming. I think we will see some reforms coming. The government said that one of their priorities is labor reform. Argentina has a very rigid labor market. And even during the times that there has been, attempts at liberalization, for example, during the 90s, the labor market sort of went unchanged, really. And this became a major problem, because as you open up the economy and sort of the economic structure of the country changes, then if you don't have a flexible labor market, what you get is usually unemployment, right? This was a major problem during the 1990s. I think the Milei administration is very conscious of that. They want to avoid that. They know that there's also a widespread informality across the Argentine economy that hinders growth. They want to tackle that, and they have said that they want to make the labor market more flexible. I think they could potentially manage to get a majority for that. There's also some expectation that the government will move forward with privatization of some state-owned businesses. Not sure exactly of which will be privatized or which will be considered acceptably privatized by the opposition. But I think there will be some sort of agreement when it comes to that. And of course, there's also deregulation that is to come, because even though the government was delegated special powers by this omnibus bill in 2024 to deregulate the economy, those special powers have expired because they were designed to last 1 year, which is why the Minister for Deregulation always had to sign a countdown to the days that his powers expired, so as to foster the work by him and his advisors. And so I think we're going to see more reform coming. I just don't see, pristine, maybe a libertarian, like 100% libertarian reform coming, just because the people in Congress are not libertarian necessarily. We have at this point, and when I think about this, I'm excited, really, because I haven't seen such a libertarian Congress in my life in Argentina. And I actually know some of these people that are in Congress, that are in the House, that are in the Senate, that I know that are true libertarians. But of course, they don't form a majority yet. So we're going to have to wait. I think we're going to see progress in the next 2 years. But then I also think that we're going to see, more promises for change after Milei's term comes to an end, if he runs for re-election, which I think he's likely to do. Because in that case, if he actually gets a majority in Congress, then things will get much easier. And maybe even reforms that are passed now, they're not 100% libertarian because they have to compromise, those may change. Labor reform is an example. There was some minor labor reform during the 2024 omnibus bill discussion. That was implemented, but it was, a very sort of small scale modification, and the government is aware that that needs to change, and so they're proposing labor reform again. And I think they will continue to do that for as long as they stay in power. Just two more things that I don't want to forget. The opening up of the economy, that has also been done mostly through decrees, because tariffs and export taxes are a prerogative of the executive power in Argentina. Fortunately, we have a president that wants to liberalize the country and open up the economy. But of course, there's limits to what he can do, because he is tied by this trade bloc, Mercosur, that is a relatively protectionist trade bloc that mostly caters to Brazil's interests. And so Argentina faces a problem that is similar to the problem that Chile faced in the 1970s and 1980s, when it wanted to open up the economy, but it was part of a trade bloc, in that case, the Pacto Andino, that sort of, constrained the degree of liberalization that they could do in terms of trade. I think Milei is going to have to decide whether he goes for reform within Mercosur or Argentina leaves Mercosur, so that we can actually eliminate tariffs and not just lower them. And the same thing with export taxes. And then one other aspect in which I hope we see reform is monetary policy. Argentina has a currency, the peso, that the people don't believe in, basically. And I don't think that the Milei administration is able to foster confidence in the long term in the peso. We've actually seen this before the midterms. There was speculation that Milei might not win, and that created a lot of tension in the markets and made the peso lose a lot of value very rapidly. That has a direct effect on the people, right? Because people earn in pesos, people have pesos. And so if the value of their currency continues to depreciate every day just because of political expectations, that's just not a good thing. So I hope we see Milei take steps toward dollarization, towards dollarizing the economy in Argentina. I'm not sure that they will do this, particularly not if they don't have a majority in Congress. But Argentina needs to eradicate inflation. This has been a nightmare for over 80 years in Argentina. No government has been able to tame inflation, to tackle this problem. But no government has also tried to tie itself to a different economy where there's also problems, of course, but none compared to the inflationary explosion that Argentina has shown in recent years. So again, we can go from anywhere, but that's just a summary of what I think we could see or we should see in the future.
Well, let's go to that point, what you think and maybe the why behind it, right? What is Marcos' story? You've mentioned once or twice already in the conversation that this is your country, right? This is, you have friends down there, you have colleagues that are now in Congress. So tell our audience a little bit about your story and what has led you on a journey that has you now as a key policy analyst with the Cato Institute.
Well, I've always been interested in classical liberalism, libertarianism, libertarian ideas. I found out about them when I was about 15 or 16 or something like that. Back then, Argentina was a very repressed country in terms of economics. It was also on the verge of political authoritarianism, left-wing authoritarianism. The Peronists were in power. They seemed to be unstoppable. This was all very concerning to me. And so I started to basically hang out with people that I found through the internet, through Facebook back then. They were trying to form what they called a liberal libertarian party in the city of Buenos Aires. And I was actually part of that in 2013. In the 2013 midterm election, I think we got 0.4% of the vote, which was not very encouraging. And so the party was dissolved because it was basically everyone chipping in, money and time, and we didn't have any major donors, and the public was just not there. The public at this point was under the spell, of Peronism, and even the opposition was also very much not classical liberal or libertarian. They tended to be social democrats, and I actually saw that when the Peronist era came to an end in 2015, and Mauricio Macri, a center-right president, took over, but he was also very much, prone to catering the left and interventionism and statism. I didn't like that, so I continued to be engaged with this very small libertarian circles in Argentina. At some point, I got to meet Alejandro Bongiovanni, who is now a representative. He's in the House. He is from Fundación Libertad, where I started to work in 2021. Before he went for Congress, I started a podcast in 2020 during the pandemic when everyone was bored in the rooms. I was like, you know what? I'm going to buy a microphone and I'm not going to let this investment go to waste. So I'm going to start a podcast. And I started interviewing classical liberal figures, mostly from Argentina, not just politicians or would-be or want-to-be politicians, but also historians and economists, and also people from abroad, from Latin America, even from the US. I remember interviewing Deirdre McCloskey back in 2020, and that sort of positioned myself as a voice in the classical liberal world. Then, with time, I also started to take part in competitions, usually essay contests, by the Mont Pelerin Society or Caminos de la Libertad in Mexico, or the Ayn Rand Institute. And that also sort of positioned me and allowed me to go to places, basically. That's how I discovered basically the Mont Pelerin Society. And that's where I met my current boss, Ian Vasquez at Cato. And so I started to work at Cato very recently, only a few months ago. And actually, I was living in Argentina until 3 months ago. And when I came to the United States, my idea was and continues to be that I want to help Argentina. Because as you said, I am from Argentina. I have friends in Argentina. I also have friends that have, sort of fled the country prior to Milei. Many of them are actually thinking of going back because they're now optimistic about the course that the country is taking. But I've seen many people, flee Argentina. Of course, not like Venezuela, where people literally have to, flee because they're politically persecuted. That was never the case in Argentina. But, economic migration was a thing until recently. I've seen lots of people go through that. But my family is still in Argentina. My heart is still in Argentina. I continue to go to Argentina. I always want to go back to Argentina, and I want to help Argentina. So when I came here, my goal was, and again, it continues to be, to help, to of course, spread the word about what's going on in Argentina that is positive, but also chip in, and say, I would like to see this going differently. I would like to see us heading in this libertarian direction or this other classical liberal direction when, it doesn't seem very easy. I know there's lots of constraints. I was just telling you how Milei only controlled 10 to 15% of Congress until very recently. You can imagine, how little work you can do under such an environment. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, in other respects, Argentina is a very sort of presidential country where the president has a lot of power. That is dangerous when the president doesn't have the right ideas. They have had the wrong ideas for a long time. Fortunately, Milei now has good ideas, and he is able to implement some of them because of this characteristic of Argentine politics. But my heart is in Argentina, and so I want to help Argentina. And this is why I continue to do research and propose, public policy changes in Argentina, of course, in other countries too, because I believe that as a libertarian, the solutions that we offer to the Argentines or to the Americans are very much the same that we can offer to the Venezuelans or to other Latin Americans or people across the world. But of course, at the Cato Institute, the Milei administration has become a priority because we have never had a self-described libertarian, even anarcho-capitalist president in the world. So that merits the attention of the Cato Institute and the entire libertarian world. And I also think that was part of the reason why, Ian wanted me to move here, and sort of become this voice that analyzes libertarianism in Argentina from the U.S.
Folks, if you are capturing this enthusiasm and this excitement from Marcos the same as I am, then I encourage you to go to atlasnetwork.org, where you can follow all of the work that Marcos is doing and his colleagues at the Cato Institute, but also all of our colleagues in Argentina and throughout Latin America. And you can access all of their information and publications, and more importantly, you can get involved. You can become a contributor. Just like my wife and I are, we're members of the Atlas Club because we want to be part of the worldwide freedom movement and support the work of folks like Marcos. And if you would like to do that, I encourage you to go to atlasnetwork.org today. And Marcos, I want to ask you about that. If you're having this conversation, as I'm sure you do many times at the wonderful events that Cato puts on, and you're engaging with a philanthropist or someone that's contributing, and they hear the story of what Milei's doing, and they say, gosh, I want to help, but will my contribution really make a difference? What do you say to donors that are thinking of investing in the worldwide freedom movement?
Well, I would say to them that their contribution in any way or form does help. I think prior to Milei, we were used to seeing disbelief within the libertarian world, just because there were, a growing number of libertarian organizations and intellectuals and policy analysts, and yet libertarianism didn't seem to get anywhere in terms of, actual political power. Now we see that it is possible. Of course, Argentina it can be a special case in many respects. It was coming from, a long period of stagnation and chaos. And I think actually that helped get a libertarian elected because of how radical his views were and how radical the change that he proposed was. But it is possible. Now we see that it is possible to see a libertarian in office, try to implement libertarian ideas, succeed in many cases. Of course, it's only been 2 years. We hope to see a lot more in the future. But I think that your contribution, whether it be in time or money, or just being there at an event, where we discussed libertarianism in terms of policy or in terms of ideas or whatever, it matters. It matters because it can get somewhere. Milei himself is, in my view, sort of a product of the libertarian think tank policy world. Because I remember I actually met Milei, so we're now in 2026. I met Milei 12 years ago, in 2014, when he was not yet a well-known economist. He was a newcomer, basically, that was sort of brought to a think tank event in the north of Argentina, in Tucumán, by a more senior economist than he was, a classical liberal that we all know in Argentina, Ricardo López Murphy. The three of us actually went to this event in Tucumán. None of us are from there. We were coming from Buenos Aires. That was actually the first essay contest that I won. I was 19, and there was this essay contest to pay tribute to a classical liberal from Tucumán, José Ignacio García Hamilton. The Federalismo y Libertad Foundation, which I believe also does work with Atlas Network, was hosting this contest. I won, and so I was going to get the prize at the same event where López Murphy and Milei were going to talk, but nobody knew who Milei was. He was there just because López Murphy had insisted that he could bring it along to present him to us, and that's when I met him. And I remember talking to him. He was very friendly. He asked about what I was doing. I was just starting college, basically. So he asked me, what was I interested in, and a number of questions that just denoted, that he was a good guy, that he was interested. He didn't have to talk to me or show any interest in me, but he did. Of course, I then lost track of him until I started to see him on TV. And then this was about 4 or 5 years later, 2018, 2019, when he started going on TV and criticizing this center-right president, Mauricio Macri, because he was not a libertarian, because he was not classical liberal enough. Even though Macri said he was a classical liberal, he said his favorite book was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, he wasn't really getting anywhere with his reforms. And so that's when I started to see Milei again. But then I kept seeing him for a while in the libertarian scene. You know, he started to go to different events by think tanks, the Fundación Libertad in Argentina, in Rosario, not just in Buenos Aires, but also across the country. And from there, you know, he sort of spread to TV and then the national political scene. So if I'm talking to donors, you know, I can tell donors that you never know where your next Milei is going to be, and you never know where the next Milei is going to stem from. And it could very well be an event that you are in, that you are supporting. And so I think, you know, I think it's worth, I think the support is worth in whatever way you think is appropriate.
That's very good, Marcos. What a great point to make. And it has me thinking. We invited folks to go to atlasnetwork.org and to get involved. And in your story, you're highlighting some areas and some experiences you've had. I know that you have had direct interaction quite a bit with Atlas Network throughout different roles. What has that interaction been like? What value have you seen, or what's the partnership with Atlas Network been like for you?
Well, Atlas Network has been very valuable for my work. First at Fundación Libertad. I'm not sure if in 2014 Atlas Network was doing work with Federalismo y Libertad in Tucumán, but it might very well have been the case. But, you know, when I started to work for Fundación Libertad in 2021, my role was intellectual, but also since Argentina is a smaller market for, or was a smaller market for libertarian ideas, I had to do other things. And so I also managed grants that in part came from Atlas Network, and those were very instrumental in supporting podcasts that we did where we spread, you know, classical liberal ideas, but not just podcasts, but, you know, events where we presented, for example, reports on what deregulation should look like, right? And just very different types of projects that appeal to different audiences that I think helped spread the word about, you know, the good that could come out of libertarian ideas. I think the value that I see in Atlas Network is usually highest when it comes to just banding all of us together. Also, you know, just setting up these conferences where we can get in touch with libertarians from other countries, because most of the time, particularly in countries like Argentina, which struggle, you know, with its politics and economics, we tend to look inward a lot and not that much outward. But the conferences that Atlas does every year, you know, the Liberty Forums, the Latin America Liberty Forum in particular, is a place where I have met, you know, many people and where I have learned about what they're doing in their own countries and what the problems are in their own countries and how they're going about and facing them. Because most, I'm not sure if most of the time, but sometimes those problems are very similar. And the approaches that you may take in a different country may work in Argentina too. It's just that I've never thought about, you know, this way of viewing the problem. And it's usually been the case that Latin America does have similar issues. You know, socialism of the 21st century is a brand that sort of spread everywhere, really, from Venezuela to, you know, Argentina and Ecuador, and well, yeah, Chile also, and Brazil in different ways. And so those problems, you know, we sort of have to face together. And so the Atlas Network is particularly valuable when it comes to, you know, just given us a sense of context of where we are in the world and what is going on in other places that we can learn from. And I've had invaluable experiences, not just the Liberty Forum, but also, for example, at the Liberty, the World Liberty Forum, the Liberty Dinner in New York. I only attended for the first time a couple of months ago, and I was impressed really because, other than the Mont Pelerin Society, I hadn't seen such a large-scale libertarian event in the world. But of course, the MPS is a totally different thing, right? Because it's for members, and members can bring guests, but it's just not open. And Atlas Network is open to the world. And I was just I left, with a sense of optimism and just enthusiasm for the work that is being done in places that I never even thought about libertarianism, like Georgia. And that's really valuable.
Yeah, and those events, of course, coming up in Lima, Peru, the very last week of February, will be the Latin America Liberty Forum. And then, as Marcos said, every November, it's a can't miss event in New York City, Times Square, the Liberty Forum, and then annual Freedom Dinner, where the worldwide freedom movement always comes together. Folks, you can get information on that at atlasnetwork.org. Now, Marcos, as a guest on this show, I've got to hit you with one or two questions. I'm a foodie, and I love experiencing the culture throughout the worldwide freedom movement. And so you've mentioned several times here about your passion for your home in Argentina. So I hit our friend Augustine up with this. Augustine was on early podcast that we had. So I have to ask you as well. If we were having this conversation right outside of the home you grew up in, let's just say, and we were going to go grab something to eat or do something in town, what are we doing? What is the Argentinian experience we're about to have?
Well, I think the unmissable experience in Argentina that you have to have in terms of food is an asado, right? Which is our sort of barbecue. Although, unlike the US, we don't really throw in lots of sauces, for the meat. It's just basically meat and salt, and that's it. We do have this sauce called chimichurri, which sort of adds a little flavor if you're missing some flavor to your meat. But asado is what I would have you eat with fries, right? Asado with fries is just, I think it's the best experience you can have, and you should have that when you go to a parrilla, which is basically a place where, a sort of barbecue place, literally, where you can get very different types of meat, not just asado, but also, entraña, which is skirt steak, or ojo de bife, ribeye, or you can get chorizo, or you can get salchicha parrillera, which is, sort of barbecue sausage, kind of that I don't really see in the U.S. that much. But, different kinds of meats, I think that's what you should have. Now, I personally don't drink, but I know that people, what they do is they drink red wine with meat, even if this may be in the night, but also in the in the middle of the day, if we're talking about a weekend, right? So I think the true Argentinian experience or Argentine experience would be, Sunday, 1 p.m., someone cooking asado, chorizo, entraña, and salchicha parrillera, and many different types of meat, fries coming up, and wine, red wine, at the table. We have, again, I don't drink, but I know we have very good wine coming from Mendoza, Argentina. So the West, if you ever come to Argentina, of course, you're going to come in through Buenos Aires, most likely, although you don't have to, but most likely you'll come through Buenos Aires. But I would recommend you go to very different places in Argentina. Fortunately, we can cater to most people's interests. So if you are interested in sort of the desert, or the mountains, or the jungles, or the glaciers, or the beach, we have all possibilities for you. Mendoza is one of them. It's by the Andes, so you're gonna get, if you go in the winter, you may get snow. You will see the Andes all the time, basically, but you'll also be able to visit, all the places where wine is made. And I know there's been some interest by Americans in that area. But again, if you want to do something else, you could go to the glaciers down south in Patagonia. You can visit Bariloche, which is a sort of Swiss-like town by the Andes also, but it's a different kind of Andes because it's a lot more green, because it rains, and it's cold, but not that cold. If you want to go to the beach, you go to my hometown. My hometown is called Mar del Plata. Mar del Plata is the main beach town in Argentina. Right now is the time to be there. I'm very sorry that I'm not there right now. We're recording this in January. Right now it's the summer in Argentina. I'm used to spending summers in Argentina, so I'm a little homesick right now. If you like the jungle, you like waterfalls, you go see the Cataratas del Iguazu, the Iguazu waterfalls, which are shared with Brazil and Paraguay up in the northeast. And then the northwest has a sort of Grand Canyon-like scene, which is sort of desertic, but mountainous also. And it's also where the sort of Native Americans of Argentina still live, because Argentina is a overwhelmingly European country in terms of ethnicity, but the Northwest is where things are still a little different, and but also where the colonial, influence of the Spanish from the 17th, 18th century can still be felt. So really, I mean, we've got it all. Anywhere in those places, you can get an asado, which is a good thing, and I think that's what you should do.
Yeah, and I want to do it soon. You've got us all hungry and excited about Argentina. And you made this point before, but I was thinking about it while you were talking about that tourism is probably picking up as there's more enthusiasm. This is probably one of the impacts of Milei. And you talked about economic migration, but let's talk about the other direction and the attention the world has now on Argentina. Whether it be for tourism, trade, investment. So as we land this plane on the conversation today, Marcos, I want to know your hope for the future for Argentina, right? What do you hope is the next 3 to 5 years that we experience? And maybe what are some of the challenges that you think could prevent that hope that we need to be paying attention to see if Milei and the new government can lead through?
Well, I think the ultimate goal should be that everyone who has had to leave for economic reasons can come back. And so I'm starting to see optimism within the Argentinian diaspora of people that want to go back. But of course, 2 years are not enough. 4 years may not be enough. Even 8 years may not be enough. Argentina has had a long history of decline. We've been suffering for, again, almost 80 years now, serious economic decline. And despite that, so many people have stayed, and so many people continue to invest in the roots, basically, in Argentina. So I think the ultimate goal should be to see these people come back. Now, what is the way to do that? I think the way that Milei has tackled the problem so far is mostly very positive, because his main priority is to kill inflation, because inflation is the sort of cancer that has basically deprived the Argentine currency of value and has created so much instability that it became impossible to have to project economic or investment decisions in the future. And I think, we're coming down in terms of inflation. Annual inflation right now is year-to-year inflation is about 30 to 35% right now. That is still huge, but it's a lot less than 200%, or 10% a month, which we used to get in 2023. So only 3 years ago. I think if the process of disinflation, as it's called in Argentina, continues, then Milei will continue to be popular. And that in turn will give him leverage to implement radical reform, radical libertarian reform. Because so far, the priority has been to sort of stabilize Argentina, right? Even so, Milei has managed to pass significant reform, like, the end of rent control, or in terms of, internet deregulation, or airline deregulation, which is, shaping up to be one of the strongest areas in government so far. Or, the lowering of export taxes and of tariffs, the elimination of non-tariff barriers. Milei has been able to do a lot, but there's still a lot of reform to be implemented in terms of trade liberalization, in terms of privatizations, in terms of even furthering lowering public spending, because inflation has been able to sort of disguise the process of lowering public spending, because nominally, everything still goes up, basically, but that will not continue forever. And I think what concerns me the most right now is that all of this is done through the managing of the exchange rate, which I believe could be a problem in the future. I told you how before the national midterms in 2025, there was speculation that Milei might not win, and that created tension, and that led to instability. But part of that instability also was able to take place because the government was trying to manage the exchange rate. And it is trying to do so because a devaluation of the currency in Argentina and in many other countries usually translates into inflation. And so if the goal is to kill inflation, to bring inflation to zero, then you want to do everything you can to do that, right? But you cannot manage the exchange rate for too long, particularly not if you don't have central bank reserves to do it, which Argentina does not. And so it is a problem in the long term to try to fix the exchange rate, not necessarily in a formal way, but informally, right? So Argentina now has a system of bans, of currency bans, between which the peso is allowed to float. And that is good as long as the peso stays there. But then if the peso loses too much value, according to the government, then the government has to step up and spend money to prop up the peso, which is a problem. We know it's not a consistently libertarian policy. We know why it has been used pragmatically, but that can lead to problems in the future, because the process of disinflation cannot just rely on that. Because what is the problem with this process? The problem is that Argentina may become too expensive. We've seen that in the past. We are seeing people complain, mostly during 2024. Now, over 2025, things have improved. Argentina is not as expensive as it was, but the change that, for example, a foreign tourist could see from 2023 to 2024 was dramatic. Prices in dollars, in international currency, were going up tremendously because the peso was sort of stable nominally, but prices continued to go up. And so everything became more expensive in dollars. Now, Argentina is not a developed economy, and it cannot be as expensive as the United States or Switzerland or some other country. It is not. But, if this process continues, by means of which the peso is artificially strengthened to the point that we become really expensive, that is going to be a problem with growth. So that's why we advocate at the Cato Institute for dollarization. We believe that the government should have no role in terms of currencies. In Argentina, we have seen that Argentina is incapable of sustaining a free-floating currency. Not even the Milei government is allowing the peso to flow freely, truly freely. And so if Milei does everything right and the peso is still around by the time he leaves office, then that will be a tool that other presidents could use to undermine his reforms. So we are fostering dollarization because we see that as an anchor of Milei's reforms in the long term. If Milei dollarizes Argentina, then he will kill inflation, and he will be remembered for killing inflation in Argentina, which is something that nobody has been able to do in the past 80 years. So the exchange rate policy is what concerns me the most. It is not a minor issue, but compared to everything that has been done within the Milei administration, I don't think it's the most important problem or the most important aspect to feature. But it could be a problem in the future if they don't change course, which is why I would like to see that change.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode. And if you've been inspired by Marcos Falcone's insights and the story unfolding in Argentina, don't forget, freedom needs friends like you. A gift of $25 or more at Atlas Network, and you get a print subscription of Freedom's Champion magazine that helps us support heroes like Marcus here and all over the world. Go to atlasnetwork.org. I want to thank Marcos for his time. I encourage you to follow his work with the Cato Institute. And until next time, keep learning, keep sharing, and keep standing for liberty.